Finally, Jack Nicholson. He turned 89 this week. Nicholson, a three-time Oscar winner, doesn't make many public appearances these days.
And man, he might be the best of all time.
Yeah.
He won 3 Oscars. He earned 12 nominations. He built the most recognizable grin in the history of American film. And then, without a press conference, without a farewell tour, without a single explanation, Jack Nicholson simply closed the gate on his life in Los Angeles and never came back out. For close to 15 years, one of the greatest actors this country has ever produced has lived behind the walls of his home on Mulholland Drive while the world outside kept asking the same question. What actually happened to him? In February of 2025, he gave the world a rare glimpse, and if you looked closely, that brief appearance answered more than a decade of speculation ever could. This is the real story of why Jack Nicholson disappeared. To understand a man who spent his final act in hiding, you have to go back to the very beginning of his life, because Jack Nicholson's relationship with secrecy did not start in Hollywood. It started in his own living room. He was born in April of 1937, and his family came from a working-class corner of New Jersey. His mother, June, was a teenager when she became pregnant, and the father was already married to somebody else. In an era when that kind of scandal could ruin a family's reputation for a generation, June's mother made a drastic decision. She stepped in and claimed the baby as her own. From that point forward, Jack grew up believing his grandmother was his mother, and his real mother was introduced to him as an older sister. Nobody in the family corrected the story, and it held for decades. Jack didn't find out the truth until he was already a grown man in his late 30s, famous, and being profiled for a major magazine cover story. A journalist doing background research uncovered the real birth records and told him, during a phone call, that the woman he had called his sister his entire life was actually his mother, and the woman he thought was his mother was his grandmother. By the time he learned this, both women had already passed away. There was no conversation left to have, no explanation left to hear, just a truth that arrived decades too late to be discussed with the people who had lived it. Nicholson later said the revelation didn't traumatize him because he was already fully formed as a person by that point, but anyone who has studied his life closely can see the fingerprints of that secret all over the way he approached relationships for the rest of his life. He never married. He kept his romantic life famously unpredictable. He built a kind of emotional distance that let him be the center of every room while never fully belonging to anyone in it. Before any of that, though, he had to survive Hollywood, and for a long stretch of his early career, survival was not guaranteed. His first job in the industry wasn't in front of a camera at all. He worked as an errand runner at a cartoon studio, the kind of place where a young man carries mail and coffee and quietly studies how the machine of entertainment actually works from the inside. He was offered a full-time position there, but it came with a pay cut, so he turned it down. Not long after, the animation division folded anyway, and Nicholson drifted toward acting almost by accident. He studied under a respected theater teacher whose own career had been derailed years earlier during Hollywood's political blacklist era. That teacher pushed a philosophy that stuck with Nicholson for the rest of his life. Acting wasn't about performing an emotion, it was about living a life full enough that the emotion arrived naturally. For years, that philosophy didn't pay the bills. By the mid-1960s, Nicholson had appeared in more than a dozen small films, and almost nobody outside the industry knew his name. He started writing scripts out of necessity because leading roles weren't coming his way. The part that finally changed everything landed in his lap almost by chance, when another actor dropped out of a low-budget road movie after a falling out with the director. That movie was Easy Rider, and it detonated in American culture in 1969. Nicholson's performance earned him his first Oscar nomination, and the years that followed produced one of the most extraordinary runs any actor has ever put together. There was Chinatown in the mid-1970s. There was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which won him his first Academy Award and swept nearly every major category that year. There was The Shining at the start of the 1980s, a performance so unhinged and magnetic that it became a permanent fixture of pop culture. There was Terms of Endearment, which brought him his second Oscar. There was his turn as the Joker in Batman, a role for which he negotiated a profit participation deal so lucrative it reportedly paid him tens of millions of dollars. There was A Few Good Men. There was As Good as It Gets, which brought him his third and final Oscar. By the time the 20th century ended, Jack Nicholson wasn't just a famous actor. He had become a kind of American institution, a name that belonged in the same conversation as the greatest to ever do the job. And then, slowly, almost without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened, the institution began to step back. Most of the videos and articles that cover Nicholson's disappearance focus almost entirely on his physical health, and while that's certainly part of the story, there's another thread that gets far less attention: and it may explain his withdrawal from public life better than anything medical ever could. Jack Nicholson's romantic history was as legendary as his filmography, and it was also, by his own account, exhausting. He spent 17 years in a relationship with actress Anjelica Huston, one of the defining partnerships of Hollywood's late 20th century. That relationship ended abruptly and painfully when he told her over dinner that another woman was pregnant with his child. Huston, who had spent years struggling with fertility issues of her own, understood immediately what that meant, and she chose to walk away rather than share the picture with someone else. 17 years ended in a single conversation. The other woman, Rebecca Broussard, gave him 2 children in the early 1990s, a daughter named Lorraine and a son named Ray. That relationship also eventually came apart. In the years after, he was linked to actress Lara Flynn Boyle, and when that relationship ended in the early 2000s, he was already in his late 60s, and by most accounts, visibly worn down by the pace of the life he had been living. In one of his last extended interviews with the press, given to Vanity Fair in 2013, Nicholson said something that revealed far more than the rest of the article around it. He admitted he no longer felt driven to be out in the world the way he once had. He said the only projects that still interested him were ones built around genuine human emotion, the kind of material that could actually move an audience. And then, almost as an aside, he confessed that he no longer had the stamina to both work and enjoy the nightlife the way he used to, and that during the filming of his final projects, he mostly stayed in his hotel room at night instead of going out. For a man whose off-screen reputation had been every bit as loud as his on-screen work, that single admission was a window into a fundamental shift happening inside him. The appetite for risk, for spectacle, for being seen, the very engine that had powered his public persona for 4 decades, had quietly run out of fuel. And once that engine stopped, there wasn't much reason left to keep performing for an audience. His final film, a romantic comedy called How Do You Know, came out at the end of 2010. It underperformed badly at the box office. And without ever holding a press conference to announce it, without ever framing it as a retirement, Jack Nicholson simply never made another movie again. So what has he actually been doing behind those gates on Mulholland Drive for the last decade and a half? The honest answer is complicated, and it's made up of several different threads that all tightened around the same time. Rumors of memory issues started circulating within a few years of his last film, with some outlets suggesting he had stepped away because he could no longer reliably learn his lines. People close to him pushed back on that specific claim, insisting he wasn't dealing with any kind of cognitive illness and was still actively reading scripts. But the years kept passing, and none of those scripts ever turned into a finished film. At one point in the mid-2010s, he was reportedly attached to star in an English-language remake of a well-regarded German comedy. For a moment, it looked like a genuine return to the screen was possible. Then he quietly dropped out and the project fell apart without him. Reports from the early 2020s describe a man who almost never leaves his property anymore, who is physically stable but whose world has shrunk down to a very small circle of people. His 2 children, Lorraine and Ray, have become central figures in his day-to-day life. Ray, who has built his own acting career in recent years, has spoken publicly and warmly about his father, describing how different their 2 lives and eras have been while also making clear how much time they've spent together, sharing meals and simply being present with one another. It's the kind of relationship that doesn't make headlines, but it appears to be one of the steadiest parts of Nicholson's life today. Then came the night that told the world more than any interview could have. On February 16, 2025, NBC aired a massive primetime special celebrating 50 years of Saturday Night Live, and the audience inside Studio 8H in New York was packed with some of the biggest names in entertainment history. From his seat in the crowd, wearing a dark jacket, tinted glasses, and a beret with a New York Yankees logo stitched across the front, 87-year-old Jack Nicholson leaned toward a microphone and spoke 5 words. He introduced his old anger management co-star Adam Sandler, who then picked up a guitar and performed an emotional tribute to 5 decades of the show. The room erupted. Sandler pointed into the crowd and thanked him by name, visibly moved that Nicholson had made the effort to be there at all. It was Nicholson's first public appearance in close to 2 years, and the photographs taken outside his hotel the next morning told their own story. He was seen leaving with a cane, moving carefully, accompanied by his daughter. Some fans online said he still looked sharp for his age. Others noted, more quietly, just how much the years had changed him. He was 87 years old that night, decades removed from the man who terrorized a hotel corridor with an axe or lit up a courtroom with a single line about the truth. But here's what made that appearance so significant. In his entire career, Jack Nicholson never once hosted Saturday Night Live, and he had reportedly said in the past that it was one of his real regrets. So when he showed up for the show's 50th anniversary, not as a host, not on stage, but simply as a guest in the crowd offering a warm introduction to an old friend, it read less like a comeback and more like a quiet goodbye. 5 words, 1 room, 1 night, and then he went home. Later that same year, the world he had mostly withdrawn from delivered a painful reminder of just how much it was still capable of taking from him. In October 2025, longtime friend and frequent collaborator Diane Keaton passed away at 79 years old, with her family confirming the cause as pneumonia. Keaton and Nicholson had shared the screen together decades earlier and had remained close for years afterward, part of the small handful of people who still had genuine access to the man behind the gates. For someone who had already narrowed his world down to a tight circle of family and old friends, losing one more person from that circle was not a small thing. Even amid that isolation, there have been moments where the old instincts still surface. Friends who have stayed close to him over the decades describe a man who checks in, who still recognizes the people who mattered to him, and who remains capable of quiet generosity even from behind his own walls. During the devastating Los Angeles wildfires in January of 2025, reports suggested he reached out to offer support to people in his circle who had lost their homes, without ever turning the gesture into a public story. It's a small detail, but it fits the pattern of a man who never stopped caring about the people around him, even as he stopped needing an audience for it. So why did Jack Nicholson really disappear? There isn't a single clean answer because there rarely is with a life this complicated. His body slowed down and he said so himself plainly in one of his last interviews. His appetite for the work changed because the industry around him had changed into something built on franchises and digital spectacle that had little use for the kind of raw, unpredictable, dangerous energy he had built his entire legend on. The relationships that once tethered him to public life came apart, one after another, until what remained was mostly family and a handful of loyal old friends. And underneath all of it sits a quieter, more self-aware explanation, one that people close to him have offered directly to the press. Those closest to him have said, in plain terms, that he simply prefers people remember him as he was. That is not the statement of a man in crisis. That is the statement of a man making a deliberate choice. Jack Nicholson spent his whole career mastering presence, understanding better than almost anyone alive exactly how an image gets built and exactly how fragile it can be once the wrong version of it takes hold. So he chose to protect the version the world already loved by stepping away before that image could fade in front of an audience. He didn't lose Hollywood. He walked away from it on his own terms, without a press tour, without a farewell speech, without ever asking the public for one final round of applause before the curtain came down. The man who gave us an axe splintering through a door, who gave us a grin that could charm a room or unsettle it depending on the angle, who gave us 4 decades of performances that still hold up against anything being made today, decided that the most fitting final act was no act at all. Just a quiet house on a hill above Los Angeles, a small circle of people who still get to see him, and a body of work that genuinely needs nothing else added to it to be remembered as one of the greatest in the history of American film. If this look at Jack Nicholson's life and disappearance gave you something new to think about, let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed it, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the stories behind the biggest names in Hollywood history.